Ladies and gentlemen, we want to welcome you on behalf of the Wheatley Institution and Brigham Young University to this session of the Defense of the Family Conference, where we've chosen to focus on natural law perspectives. We're happy to have with us some distinguished guests and friends of BYU and the Wheatley Institution. We're especially honored to have Elder L. Tom Perry of the Quorum of 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Elder Quentin L. Cook, also a member of the Quorum of 12 Apostles of the Church. We also have with us President Cecil O. Samuelson, President of BYU. And Jack Wheatley will be joining us shortly. Jack is the engine, both in terms of energy and vision of the Wheatley Institution, and we're happy to have him with us this afternoon. We have a panel of distinguished scholars who've joined us for the day. We've had the pleasure of listening to them and being in their presence and benefiting from their insights. Seated to my far right is Professor W. Bradford Wilcox of, I get that, the W's in the right spot, isn't it, Brad? From the University of Virginia, the Department of Sociology, who's been here to make a presentation. Professor Catherine Pacolic from Ave Maria University, who presented earlier in the day, is also with us. And we're pleased to have, as the keynoter of this conference, Professor Robert George from Princeton University. See, on my left, we have His Honor, Judge Tom Griffith, an appellate court judge from the D.C. District and former general counsel of Brigham Young University, and Professor Paul Carey from our history department at BYU, who will make brief comments following Professor George's presentation. Following those comments, we'd like to have, and we've set the table up to facilitate a question and answer session from you as an audience. Because we're taping this, I would invite you to turn off electronic equipment that may make a noise. And also, when we get to the question and answer session, because we're recording it, about the only place we can let you ask your questions is in that microphone to your right and my left, there about midway back in the hall. Professor Robert P. George, is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and founder and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He is also a professor of politics and an associated faculty member of the Department of Philosophy at Princeton. He's a former member of the President's Council on Bioethics and previously served as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He has also served on UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology, of which he remains a corresponding member. He was a judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. Professor George is the author of a number of books and influential articles, many of which have been discussed during our time together today, including Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality. This is one of his earlier works. In Defense of Natural Law from Oxford University in 1999. Most recently, he's the co-author of Embryo, A Defense of Human Life in 2008, and Body Self-Dualism in Contemporary Ethics and Politics, Cambridge University Press, also 2008. His articles and scholarly work have appeared in excellent journals, including a recent article in the Harvard Law Review. He's also published in venues too numerous to mention. He is a graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School. He also earned a master's degree in theology from Harvard and a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford University. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Robert P. George, who will talk about the topic, What is Marriage? Professor George.
Thank you very much, Professor Williams, and thank you all for coming to be with us this afternoon. President Samuelson, it's such a great pleasure to be back at Brigham Young University. I will say today what I said yesterday when I had the opportunity to speak, that after the wonderful reception that I received the last time I was here to give a forum address, and after forming such a profound and important relationship with so many members of your faculty, in many cases working together on the moral questions, especially marriage, that we care about. When I step onto the BYU campus now, I feel that I'm coming home, that I'm among family, and I appreciate that very, very much. I also want to take this opportunity to say thank you and congratulations to the LDS community. It has truly, for me, been a privilege to work alongside the leadership of the church and so many of the faithful in the great struggle to defend and to rebuild the institution of marriage. The greatest victories that we've achieved thus far against, in some cases, overwhelming odds simply would not have been possible without the determination and the fidelity and the generosity, both in terms of financial assets and just time and attention of the LDS community. I know that the LDS community has paid a price for that fidelity. I've paid something of a price myself. We've been on the receiving end of threats, of intimidation, of defamation, and it's not pleasant. I understand that. I understand what you've been through as a result of your fidelity and your godly witness, and I greatly admire your courage for standing up in the face of it, refusing to back down, for standing up lovingly for what is right and what is good. Thank you. Thank all of you, and congratulations to you and to the LDS Church. It's a very special honor for me. Indeed, I can't tell you how honored I am that Elder Perry and Elder Cook would make a special visit out here to attend my talk. My opportunities to work with the leadership of the church have shown me religious witness, spiritual leadership that's quite extraordinary in the quorum of the 12 apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is inspiring to me. These men have inspired me. They're great spiritual leaders, and I look to them for leadership. And so you can imagine what an honor it is for me to have these two men sitting right in front of me. Thank you very much, Elder Perry and Elder Cook. Mr. Wheatley, I don't know if Mr. Wheatley's here, but I want to congratulate him. I want to congratulate him for his vision and for his generosity. This forum is only one of many contributions that the Wheatley Institution is making to the defense of the family and to upholding, strengthening core institutions. It's not that the family alone is in jeopardy today. Really, all of the core institutions of our society, our polity, our civilization, are at stake. This is a multifaceted set of challenges that we face. And I thank God, and I thank Brigham Young, and I thank Mr. Wheatley that the Wheatley Institution is here to get its oar into the water in helping to defend and to rebuild the institutions that are so vital to the flourishing of human beings. Why do we care about these institutions? Why do we care about marriage? We care because we care about people. We care about human beings, our fellow citizens, our fellow human creatures, made as we are made in the very image and likeness of God. These institutions exist to serve their well-being, to serve their flourishing. And when they erode, and when they decay, and when they collapse, the cost is counted in human suffering, human degradation. Catherine and Brad today, great scholars on whom I myself have relied for many, many years. I've relied on Brad's social scientific work to inform my work in the more philosophical domain. And now Catherine, of course, is emerging as such an important scholar in the economics of the family area. But when we struggle for these institutions, we struggle because we know from the social science what the costs are when these institutions break down. And guess what? Although we all suffer, all sectors of society suffer when marriage breaks down, when the family breaks down, when sexual anarchy replaces what was once a flourishing marriage culture. All sectors, rich and poor, suffer. Do you know who suffers the most? Brad can tell you. It's the poor. It's the most vulnerable. They are the ones who can't buy themselves out of the material consequences of family breakdown, of sexual anarchy, of fatherlessness. We all suffer the spiritual consequences and the moral consequences. But the wealthy can, to some extent, soften the blow with their wealth. The poor cannot. They are the ultimate victims. As I said to the Fidelio group yesterday, Elder Cook, when my liberal colleagues sometimes say to me, okay, look, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right about the family. Maybe you're right about sexual morality. But really, why do you put so much emphasis on it? Why do you speak out so loudly and annoyingly about it? Why do you make it such a big deal? I mean, there are more important issues you could be devoting yourself to. Why don't you put the same focus on poverty? And I say, don't you guys get it? The reason I care about marriage and the family is because marriage is the greatest anti-poverty mechanism ever created by man. You want poverty? You can produce it. Break down marriages. You want to get people out of poverty? You can do it. Rebuild the marriage culture. Because marriage is the original and best Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. No government system, no government entity can reproduce it, can accomplish what it accomplishes when it's flourishing. But of course, when it collapses, as Brad Wilcox said just a few minutes ago, the government will step in. It'll step in two ways: to provide social services to women trying to raise children alone in circumstances where they're very vulnerable because of crime and violence and despair and hopelessness. And the state will step in to police the situation. So it'll be social services and security. We all pay for that. We pay for it in terms of taxes, the growth of government. It undermines the principle of limited government. But someone's got to do it if the family breaks down. Will the state do it as well? No way. No way. It'll just do the best it can in a bad situation, but with costs to be paid even for that. Which is why those of us who really do care about our fellow human beings, those of us who really do care about the flourishing of people, really need to be where you, LDS people, are. God bless you. And that is in the forefront of the fight to protect and defend marriage and to rebuild the marriage culture, to defend the family, what we're here about today. As I was wandering around in the halls looking around, I happened just a few minutes ago on a quote that I found so profound and for me personally moving that I've written it down. And I'm going to read it, although I gather that it's probably something that all of you know very well. It's from 1955, Ezra Taft Benson, and here's what Mr. Benson said. And I think this is so appropriate for a conference on natural law and the defense of the family, where we're seeking wisdom and truth. Benson said, "The quest for wisdom or intelligence, which the Lord defines as light and truth, is a glorious challenge. We have been assured by the author of eternal life that," and he quotes here, "whatever principle of intelligence we attain unto in this life, it will rise with us in the resurrection." To which I want to say, amen. That's exactly right. Our good works, our pursuit of human goods, including the good of marriage and the family, including the good of knowledge and wisdom, are not just passing things. We don't leave them behind. We can see in the light of faith that we will find them again. They're not lost. We don't just do them and then that's it. But we're promised that we will find them again. In my own tradition, the Catholic tradition, there's a profound statement of the same thing in the Second Vatican Council in a document called Gaudium et Spes, where it says that at the end of our own lives and ultimately in the resurrection, we will not see the good that we did in the world lost, but rather we will recover all the goods that through our effort we have achieved. But, and I think this is a beautiful way it's put by the Vatican Council, burnished and freed from stain, recovered again, but now even better, because perfected by our Lord himself, burnished and freed from stain. Okay, what is marriage? What a question to ask. Don't we all know what marriage is? Those of us here are the products, for the most part, of marriages. Many of us are in marriages. We need to ask the question, what is marriage? Well, perhaps an earlier generation didn't need to ask the question, but precisely because marriage is under attack today. And not just from people who outwardly and explicitly oppose it, but from people who wish to redefine it. We need to ask the question, what is marriage? We need to get clear on what marriage is. We can't just go on the basis of tradition or even just the teaching of religious authority. We need to understand marriage as a natural and beautiful and important, indeed essential, human institution. An institution ordained by God and blessed by God, but nevertheless a human institution made by men and women who enter into marriages, protected and recognized by legal systems, regulated even by legal systems. We have to ask the question. And we need to ask the question for another reason. And it's for this reason that I'm about to articulate that together with two of my former students, Sharif Gergis and Ryan Anderson, I wrote the article, What is Marriage?, which seems to have caused quite an uproar. I just learned that this article, which was published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy on my wedding anniversary, December 11th, a little over a month ago, is now the #1 most frequently downloaded social science paper in the last 12 months. And of the, I'm going to brag here a little bit, of the 350,000 papers that have been posted on the Social Science Research Network since it's in the past 17 years since it was created. In a month, that paper has become the 16th most frequently downloaded paper in the whole history of the thing. I think people want to know, what is marriage? They must be downloading it for some reason, unless they're throwing darts at it or something like that. Now, why? What's that second reason we need to know what is marriage? We need to raise this question. It's because those who do propose to redefine marriage to accommodate same-sex partnerships and possibly other sorts of partnerships, multi-party partnerships, so-called polyamorous unions, are asserting that it's necessary both morally and constitutionally to redefine marriage because marriage as traditionally, historically defined, the conjugal union of husband and wife, is discriminatory. That the principle of equality, to which we are committed in our Declaration of Independence and via the 14th Amendment of our Constitution, the principle of equality requires that same-sex partners be given, quote, access, unquote, to marriage on the same terms as opposite-sex partners. But my co-authors and I want to make the point that you can never understand what equality requires or doesn't require unless you understand the thing by reference to which the appeal to equality is being made. In other words, in order to determine whether in a court of law or just as citizens reflecting on what's right or wrong, just and unjust, in order to determine whether equality does require marriage to be redefined to accommodate same-sex couples, we need to know what is marriage. Now, on one account of marriage, what we call the revisionist view, and distinguished from the conjugal view, which was the traditional view of marriage, on the revisionist view, marriage is simply a kind of romantic friendship. It's a way in which two people join together on the basis of an essentially emotional union. It doesn't have anything to do with children. You might or might not have children. Depends on whether you go in for that kind of thing. It doesn't have really anything intrinsically to do with sex. You might just as well integrate your relationship around tennis playing or reading novels. You might pledge exclusivity, if you go in for that kind of thing, not in respect of sexuality, but in respect of tennis playing, so that we could build our exclusive relationship on the basis that we agree we will never play tennis with anybody else. We may play around sexually with all kinds of people, But what we really care about is tennis. That's our shared interest that really brings us together. And so we're going to pledge fidelity to each other with respect to tennis playing. Of course, the traditional view understands marriage as a sexual relationship and as a relationship that is intrinsically and not merely incidentally related to procreation and the rearing of children. But that does not mean, for reasons I'm going to articulate in a moment, that marriage is properly understood as a mere means to having children or to rearing them properly. No, because on the conjugal view, the traditional historic view of marriage, the marital relation of husband and wife, that partnership in a relationship that's oriented toward and naturally fulfilled by the coming to be of children, is of intrinsic and not merely instrumental value. It's fulfilling of the spouses, even in circumstances where the non-behavioral conditions of procreation don't happen to obtain for them, an infertile couple, for example, yet nevertheless, they can realize the good of marriage. So let me begin now by articulating in a kind of formal way that I'll explain to you. It'll sound a little opaque, but let me get out on the table my kind of formal statement of an answer to the question, what is marriage? You want to know what is marriage? Here's what it is. Marriage is a comprehensive, multi-level union of a man and a woman who, pledging fidelity, exclusivity, and permanence of commitment, join together not merely at the emotional level, but at the bodily, that is biological, emotional, rational, volitional, and spiritual levels of being in a union that is indeed ordered to and would naturally be fulfilled by having and rearing children together. That account of marriage, I put it to you, can give an account of those features of marriage that even to this day, most people recognize as essential and not merely incidental to it. It can account not only for why marriage is an opposite-sex union and not a same-sex union. It can account for why marriage is a union pledged to fidelity and not simply pledged for as long as love lasts or for the next 6 weeks. And it can also explain what is inexplicable under the revisionist view, and that is why marriage is the union of two people and not 3 or 5 or 7 in a so-called polyamorous sexual partnership. Notice that's not a slippery slope argument saying, well, if we recognize same-sex unions, we're going to pretty soon be recognizing polyamory, though we will. I'd be perfectly willing to make that slippery slope argument, but I'm not making it now. Newsweek magazine's helping me to make it by pointing out the fact that we now have 500,000 polyamorous households in the United States. I actually have a college friend who's in a polyamorous union. You know, he's got 3 or 4 either husbands and wives, and they've got a couple of kids that somehow have gotten into this thing. I don't know where they came from. But yeah, polyamory is out there. And just as same-sex relations seemed, the idea that there'd be a same-sex marriage seemed inconceivable 20 years ago, well, it's conceivable today, and so will polyamory. So I'd be happy to make the polyamory the slippery slope argument. In fact, there are plenty of people on the other side who've let the cat out of the bag, including 300 self-identified gay and lesbian activists and leaders who've publicly called for the recognition of polyamory. They include such notable figures as Barbara Ehrenreich, Gloria Steinem, my own co-teacher at Princeton, Cornell West. So it's not a fringe position. So the slippery slope argument is an argument I'm happy to make, but it's not the argument I'm making here, not the argument I'm making today. The argument I'm making today is that the revisionist understanding that would accommodate same-sex partnerships as legally recognized marriages simply can give no account of why marriage is a union of 2 people and not 3 or 5 or 7 people in a group marriage, all married together. Marriage is thus, in a profound sense, linked to procreation and rightly has been regarded historically as a procreative partnership. But the marital relationship is not properly understood as merely instrumental, that is, as a mere means to responsible procreation and sound child rearing. For marriage is as Plato understood, which is pretty good evidence that this is not a uniquely Christian or even Judeo-Christian notion, for marriage is as Plato understood, and as Christianity has historically taught, intrinsically valuable, something inherently fulfilling of men and women who unite as spouses, even when it's not possible for them to have children. Now, let me begin by explaining the philosophical grounds of the moral judgment that marriage is inherently an opposite-sex union and an exclusive one, a union of one man and one woman, and to discuss the arguments made by a prominent same-sex unions or same-sex marriage defender named Stephen Macedo, who happens to be another colleague of mine at Princeton, and other critics of traditional matrimonial law in their efforts to undermine this traditional judgment. Marriage, I think, if you understand it historically, both in our religious traditions and in our legal tradition and in the broad philosophical tradition that does go back to the Greek philosophers and the Roman jurists, marriage is best understood as a two-in-one-flesh communion of persons, that is, a biological bodily union of persons. That means sex is intrinsic to it, not incidental. A two-in-one-flesh, of course, the language is from the Bible, that Genesis 1, that the man shall leave his mother and the woman her home, and the two shall become one flesh. The Bible doesn't say they're going to be so emotionally close that it's kind of like they're one flesh. The Bible says the two will become one flesh. How could that be possible? I'll explain. Marriage is a two-in-one-flesh communion of persons that is consummated and actualized by acts that are procreative in type, whether or not they are procreative in effect or are even motivated in part by a desire to procreate. Obviously, an infertile couple, a couple where the wife is past childbearing and so forth, can't intend to procreate. You can't intend what you know to be impossible. But I think marriage is best understood historically, the way we account for its features, that even those that are not controversial today, as consummated in the first instance, as our law has always held, and actualized and refreshed by acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation. And it doesn't make any difference to them being truly marital acts, whether the non-behavioral conditions of procreation happen to obtain, precisely because marriage is an intrinsic good and not an instrumental one. It's not even instrumental to the great good of having children. The bodily union, the biological union of spouses in marital acts, is the biological matrix, indeed the foundation of their marriage, considered as a multi-level relationship that unites persons at every level of their being. Yesterday I went through this in my general lecture on natural law that I presented. Think about what kinds of creatures we are, right? We're complicated critters. We're biological, right? We're organisms. But we're not like trees or even centipedes or even bears because we're also rational. We make free choices. We engage in conceptual thinking. So we're biological, but we're also rational. We're not disembodied. We're emotional. We have feelings, desires. We're capable of volition. We can choose, we can will, we act. And we're spiritual beings. And marriage is a comprehensive, multi-level union, unique among the forms of friendship, really distinctive in that it unites two people at every level of their being, the biological, the emotional, the rational volitional, the dispositional, the spiritual. No other form of friendship does that. And it helps to explain why no other form of friendship requires exclusivity or is pledged to permanence. I mean, it's good that we want to be friends with our friends for our entire lives. We want them to be lifetime friends. But, it's not considered the sin of abandonment if we move away or lose contact with them or what have you, because an ordinary friendship isn't pledged to permanence or exclusivity. I can be friends with Professor Williams and I can be friends with Professor Wilcox, and they don't care. They're not going to get jealous of each other. But if I try to be in a group marriage, I'm violating the very thing that marriage is supposed to be about, that very exclusivity that's distinctive to marriage. Marriage, precisely as a comprehensive multi-level sharing of life, that unique kind of friendship, is naturally ordered to the good of procreation and to the nurturing and education of children, as well as to the good of spousal unity, the common sharing of the burdens of life and the joys of life. And these goods, as Catherine's presentation so nicely showed us, are really naturally tightly bound together. Tightly bound together. The distinctive unity of spouses is possible precisely because humans, like other mammalian males and females, by mating, unite organically. They become a kind of single reproductive unit. Now, although reproduction in humans and other mammals is a single act, in humans the reproductive act is performed not by individual members of the species, but by the mated pair as an organic unit. This point has been explained very well by the philosopher Germain Grisey. Grisey says, and I quote him, "Though a male and a female are complete individuals with respect to other functions, for example, nutrition, sensation, and locomotion, with respect to reproduction, they are only potential parts of a mated pair, which is the complete organism capable of reproducing sexually. Even if the mated pair is sterile, intercourse, provided it is the reproductive behavior characteristic of the species, makes the copulating male and female one organism." Now, he's absolutely right about that, but it's important not to misunderstand him. He doesn't mean that suddenly there's no longer two people, that once humans mate, they kind of have to walk around attached to each other the rest of their lives. That's not his point. That's obviously ridiculous. But he's making the profound point that in respect of one aspect of our personhood, and our body is not a mere instrument of our persons, the body's part of the personal reality of the human being. We're united in that way, unified, that in respect of most functions, most human acts, the entity performing the act is the individual organism. We're now digesting our lunch, each of us as an individual. That's not something that's done as a mated pair or as a group. When I walked up to the podium, locomotion was a human function, a human act, but it was performed by an individual, namely me. But notice that with respect to reproduction, things are different. Reproduction is one act, but it's not performed by an individual. It's performed by a male and female as a mated pair. Their union is an organic union, a biological union, a union at the bodily level. Now, that would be of very little significance if the body were a mere extrinsic instrument of the person, as many liberals today, I think, actually believe, that what a person is a kind of consciousness or set of emotions or feelings that resides in or inhabits or is somehow associated with a body that's just an extrinsic instrument, whose actions as such are of just no moral significance. But for people who understand the body, not as sub-personal, but as part of the personal reality of the human being, then our organic union, the union of persons in the bodily dimension of their being, is just that, a personal union. It's of moral significance. It counts. Now, by the way, I'll just digress here for a moment. It's that same philosophy, which I think is erroneous, that treats the body as merely an extrinsic instrument and of no moral significance, that lies behind liberalism's embrace of abortion and increasingly even infanticide, as with my colleague Peter Singer, and with euthanasia of the frail elderly or of people who are severely mentally or even physically handicapped. Why? Well, you can see, if you think that the real person is the center of emotion that is associated with the body, but the body is just an extrinsic instrument by which the real person, being the center of emotions or consciousness, induces satisfactions. Well, then, of course, up to the point at which you have self-awareness, which might be several months after birth, as Singer points out, you have a human being, to be sure, you have a human body, but not a person. So if you kill that human being by abortion or infanticide, you haven't killed a person. Or a person suffering dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Why is Professor Singer perfectly willing to embrace euthanasia for people like that, or even people who are not elderly or near death, but who are just very severely mentally handicapped? Why? Well, because that's a human being, yes, as a biological matter, but not a person. The body is considered just subpersonal material. What really counts is this consciousness, the emotion. Now you see, if you think that it's the emotion that's the real person, and you think marriage, whatever else it is a personal union, is a union of persons, what's the marriage? Just an emotional bond. Two people of the same sex can have that. So can 3 or 4 or 5 people in a polyamorous union, like my old college classmate. But if persons are not just emotional centers associated with bodies, but if the body is part of the personal reality of the human being, then there's something really distinctive and profound that's possible when a man and woman unite in an organic way in acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation and procreative type acts, what the long legal tradition is called the act of generation. Now, although not all procreative acts are marital, obviously adultery can be a procreative act, but it's certainly not marital. I think there are no marital acts that are not procreative in type. Masturbatory or sodomitical or other sexual acts that are not procreative in type, whether performed by individuals or persons of opposite sexes or same sexes, cannot unite persons organically, that is, as a single reproductive principle. You don't become a unit, an organic unit. You don't unite in a personal way in the way that you unite bodily in acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation. Therefore, such acts cannot be intelligibly engaged in for the sake of one flesh unity as such. Rather, persons who perform such acts must be doing so for the sake of ends or goals that are extrinsic to themselves as bodily persons. Sexual satisfaction, or perhaps mutual sexual satisfaction, is sought as a means of releasing tension or obtaining or sometimes sharing pleasure, either considered as an end in itself or as a means to some other end, such as expressing tender feelings or affection or friendliness. In any case, where one flesh union cannot or cannot rightly be sought as an end in itself, sexual activity necessarily involves the instrumentalization of the bodies of those participating in such activities to extrinsic ends. That was the point that has historically made the great thinkers of our tradition, of our culture, so concerned about sexual morality. Today it's popular for people to say, oh, sex is not anything important. Sexual sins, even if they're sins, are not really important. Well, ask yourself, why did Plato think it was really important? He wasn't even a Christian. Why did St. Augustine think it was so important? Why did St. Thomas Aquinas think it was so important? Why has the Catholic Church thought it so important throughout its history? Why did the Protestant reformers, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and so forth, all think it was so important? It's that reason. It's the reduction of the human being, the body of the human being, to an instrument. It's the self-degradation of instrumentalizing the person. Now, in marital acts, by contrast, the bodies of persons who unite biologically are not reduced to the status of mere instruments. Rather, the end, the goal, the intelligible point of sexual union is the good of marriage itself. On this understanding, such a union is not a merely instrumental good, but it's rather an intrinsic good. The central and justifying point of sex is not then pleasure or even the sharing of pleasure per se, however much sexual pleasure is sought, and rightly sought, as an aspect of the perfection of marital union. The point of sex, rather, is marriage itself, defined in just the way I defined it, as a one-flesh union of persons, a comprehensive, multi-level sharing of life. Okay? So you notice that there's a problem here that can be on either end. A lot of people, because they miss the intrinsic value of marriage, think it's got to be instrumental to something. A kind of extreme conservative view would say, oh, it's instrumental to having children. So sex is only worthy when you're doing it for the sake of having children. That was Mohandas Gandhi's view. Mohandas Gandhi was very, very conservative about sexuality. I throw this into the faces of my liberal colleagues all the time because they consider themselves great admirers of Gandhi. I tell them all about Gandhi's views about sex and contraception and marriage. But I think he actually went too far, reducing marriage to a mere means to responsible procreation. Of course, the other extreme is the characteristic modern liberal one, to see marriage as instrumental to pleasure. So liberals often think, well, look, I can see why someone would want to be in a stable sexual relationship, call it marriage, for the sake of having children. And I can see why they'd want to be in such a relationship in order to have regular access to sexual pleasure. But it's got to be one or the other, right? It's got to be a means to that or to that. But they're missing what Plato saw, what the Roman jurists saw, what Christianity has historically taught, the intrinsic value of marriage itself as a comprehensive multi-level sharing of life that is made possible by the way humans procreate. No one would, I put it to you, submit to you, I put it as a question. If human beings didn't reproduce themselves sexually, would anyone ever have thought up the idea of marriage? No. But that doesn't mean that marriage is a mere means to reproduction, because it's the activity, the sharing of life of rational creatures who can form relationships of profound intrinsic value. It's more than a mere means, even to the great good of having children. Now, because in marital sex acts, sex is not instrumentalized to anything, such acts are free of the self-alienating and disintegrating qualities of non-marital sexuality. Unlike non-marital sex acts, marital acts affect no practical division of the person, separating the body, considered as an extrinsic instrument, from the conscious and desiring aspect of the self, considered as the true person who inhabits a body and uses the body to induce in the consciousness satisfying experiences or satisfactions. As John Finnis, my own great teacher at Oxford, has observed, marital acts are truly unitive and in no way self-alienating, because the bodily, biological aspect of human beings is part of, and not merely an instrument of, their personal reality. But one may ask, well, what about procreation? Did Gandhi really go too far? On the traditional view, isn't it, as some people mistakenly think, the sexual union of spouses that's instrumentalized to the goal of having children? Well, it's true that St. Augustine leaned a little in that direction in some of his writings. He might be considered by some to be a proto-Gandhi. But and it's true that there's always been a certain following for that among Christians, certainly including among my fellow Catholics. The strict Augustinian position was rejected, however, by the mainstream of philosophical and theological reflection and the Church, Christianity itself, on both East and West, both pre- and post-Reformation, that came to be embodied in it's been rejected by the mainstream of philosophical reflection and theological reflection as embodied in both the canon law of the Catholic Church historically and in the civil law of the nations of the West, including the United States. The law, both civil and canon, never treats marriage as a mere instrumental good, even instrumental to the great and godly interest in having children. Matrimonial law has traditionally understood marriage as consummated by and only by acts of the procreative type. By contrast, and it's very important to see this, the sterility of spouses, infertility of spouses, so long as they're capable of consummating their marriages by a procreative type act and thus of achieving true organic bodily unity, infertility has never in our law, civil or canon, been treated as an impediment to marriage, even where sterility is certain and even certain to be permanent, as in the case of the marriage of a woman who has been through menopause or has undergone a hysterectomy. So notice that about our law. And this, by the way, these norms, this understanding that consummation was required to perfect a marriage, to complete a marriage. The marriage begins with consent, and you actually have a marriage when you have the consent, but it's perfected and fulfilled or sealed by consummation. And the idea that infertility is no impediment for marriage. So no matter how much the husband wants kids, maybe he's a farmer and he needs a bunch of kids to continue, the family business, and it turns out the wife can't produce them. Now, maybe it's really him who can't produce, but he always blames the wife. He can go into court and say, look, I didn't bargain for this. Judge, I want kids and she can't produce them. You need to annul this marriage. Historically, consistently, the law gave the answer no. And these norms on both ends, consummation and infertility, were put in place entirely apart from any consideration of homosexuality centuries before anybody ever thought that there would be a public debate about same-sex unions or same-sex so-called marriage. This wasn't gotten up to get homosexuals or to alienate them or keep them out of an institution. The norms that shaped what the very institution is were all developed in discussions, debates, legal proceedings involving married couples, couples that were lawfully married, ordinarily had been through a religious ceremony. Now, according to the traditional understanding of marriage, then, it is the nature of marital acts as procreative in type that makes it possible for such acts to be unitive in the distinctly marital way. That is, to be unitive because they unite spouses in a type of relationship that would be fulfilled by the coming to be of children. And there's intrinsic value in that relationship, even if some impediment prevents children from coming to be. This type of unity, in other words, has intrinsic and not merely instrumental value. Thus, the unitive good of marriage provides a non-instrumental and thus sufficient reason for spouses to perform sexual acts of a type that consummates and actualizes their marriage. In performing marital acts, the spouses do not reduce themselves as bodily persons or reduce their marriage to the status of a means or an instrument. When people start reducing their marriage to the status of a means, that's when you start getting the kind of phenomena that Catherine and Brad talked about today, where one spouse can say to the other, look, you know, you're a nice guy, but I want out of this because I'm just not getting out of it what I hoped and expected. They're viewing their marriage as a means to getting something out of it, rather than, as Brad so beautifully put it, Professor Wilcox so beautifully put it, as an opportunity to serve one's spouse and to serve one's children, and to come to get pleasure from doing it. Brad pointed out that, I forget, actually it was Brad or Catherine, maybe it was Catherine who pointed out that guess what? The couples who are happiest in marriage are the couples who are primarily focused on serving and giving and not on getting happiness. You want happiness, don't look for it. It comes to those who seek to serve. I don't know who said it, but whoever said it said something very wise. I've myself been married for 28 years now, and I increasingly appreciate how true this is, that in the beginning, love sustains the marriage. And as time goes on, marriage sustains the love. It's the commitment to the marriage that sustains the love. Now, at the same time, where marriage is understood properly as a one-flesh union of persons, children who may be conceived in marital acts are understood not as ends which are extrinsic to marriage, either in the strict Augustinian sense or the modern liberal one, but rather, and this is so important, as gifts which supervene on acts whose central justifying point is precisely the marital union of spouses. Such acts have unique meaning, value, and significance because they belong to the class of acts by which children characteristically and naturally come into being. More precisely, these acts have their unique meaning, value, and significance because they belong to the class of acts by which children come into being, not as products or desire or satisfactions of desire which their parents choose to have because I want, but rather as perfective participants in the organic community, that is the family, that's established by their parents' marriage. That's why I think Catherine's absolutely right to say, you know, we shouldn't be just even talking about something as nice to talk about as large families. I like the idea of large families. I like large families. Catherine's right. We should reclaim the language of the natural family. It's thus that children are properly understood and treated even in their conception, not as means to their parents' ends or subjects of desire or satisfaction, but as ends in themselves, not as objects of desire, the desire or the will of their parents, but as subjects of justice and human rights, not as property, but as persons. Now, it goes without saying, listen to me now, it goes without saying that not all cultures have fully grasped these truths about the moral status of children. This is why children were exposed on the hills in Rome. why the Christians in some cases had to sneak in the evenings to rescue them. They were being thrown out as if they were trash. What's less frequently noticed is that our culture's grasp of these truths is connected to a basic understanding of sex and marriage. And by these truths, I mean these truths about the status of children as ends in themselves, as persons and not as property. It's connected to an understanding of sex and marriage which is not only fast eroding, but is now under severe assault from people who have no conscious desire to reduce children to the status of mere means or object or property. People who would be scandalized by the thought of what the Romans did. Yet they're buying into a philosophy that makes it very difficult to see why what the Romans did was wrong. And of course, it's a philosophy that when you see it in this light, makes it so clear why abortion doesn't seem to be a problem to some people. I mean, up until a certain point, children are just property. Up to a certain point, children are good if you want them, and if you don't want them, get rid of them. Now, it's sometimes thought that defenders of traditional marriage law deny the possibility of something whose possibility critics of the law affirm. Love, these critics say, makes a family. You probably heard that slogan. Love makes a family. This was the big slogan of the gay marriage activists in California during the Prop 8 struggle. And they say that it is committed love that justifies homosexual sex and relationships just as much as it justifies, quote, heterosexual sex and relationships. If marriage is the proper or best context for sexual love, this argument goes, then marriage should be available to loving, committed same-sex as well as opposite-sex partners on terms of strict equality. Now, that's how the argument is made, and I'm going to say why I think it's a bad argument. But I also think that in a great many cases, it's a disingenuous argument. When push comes to shove, I find very few people, and I engage people on the other side all the time, very few people on the other side who really do believe that a proper relationship, whether it's same-sex or opposite sex, is sexually exclusive. And if we look at the data of studies, especially of the male homosexual subculture, it's very clear that monogamy is not the norm. Exclusivity is not the norm. There's a recent study of all places in the New York Times, revealed in the New York Times. The New York Times covered the study. The study was done by scholars at San Francisco State University. Brad Wilcox, I'm sure, can give us more details, in which showed that among same-sex married partners in California and others, I believe, in same-sex legal unions, the vast majority were in so-called open relationships. The New York Times headline said, an open secret about gay relationships or gay marriages. Open means not sexually exclusive. In fact, one leading gay rights scholar has said that, well, you have to understand that in the gay community, monogamy doesn't mean sexual exclusivity. It means a unique emotional bond between two people who might freely then have sexual relationships with lots of other people. In fact, however, at the bottom of the debate is a possibility that defenders of traditional marriage law affirm and its critics deny, namely the possibility of marriage as what our law and philosophical and theological traditions have always taught it is, namely a one-flesh union of persons. That's what the real issue is. Is bodily biological unity a unity of persons, and is it really possible? The denial of this possibility is central to any argument designed to show that the moral judgment at the heart of traditional marriage law is unreasonable, unsound, or untrue. If procreative-type acts in fact unite spouses as persons, that is interpersonally, as traditional sexual morality and marriage law suppose, then it has to be the case that such acts differ fundamentally in meaning, value, and significance from the only types of sexual acts that can be performed by same-sex partners. Liberal sexual morality in denying that marriage is inherently an opposite-sex relationship necessarily supposes that the value of sex must be instrumental either to procreation or to pleasure, considered in turn as an end in itself or as a means of expressing affection or tender feelings or so forth. Thus, proponents of the liberal view, such as my colleague Stephen Macedo, suppose that homosexual sex acts are morally indistinguishable from heterosexual marital intercourse whenever the motivation for marital intercourse is something other than procreation. The sexual acts of homosexual partners, that is to say, what he says, are indistinguishable in motivation, meaning, and value from the marital acts of spouses who know at least one spouse is temporarily or permanently infertile. Thus, the liberal argument goes, traditional matrimonial law sins against the principle of equality in treating sterile heterosexual couples as capable of marrying, while treating homosexual partners as ineligible to marry. That's the argument you hear all the time, right? Well, you can't really think it has to do with procreation because, you let people who know they are infertile enter into marriages. Thus, Macedo accuses the traditional view and its defenders of a double standard. He asks, quoting him here, what is the point of sex in an infertile marriage? Not procreation. The partners, let us assume, know that they are infertile. If they have sex, it is for pleasure and to express their love or friendship or some other shared good. It will be precisely for the same reasons that committed, loving gay couples have sex. But Macedo's allegation of a double standard, the centerpiece of his attack and the attack of the gay movement on traditional sexual morality, fails to tell against the traditional view because it presupposes as true precisely what the traditional view denies, namely, that the value and thus the point of sex in marriage can only be instrumental. On the contrary, it is a central tenet of the traditional view that the value and point of sex is the intrinsic good of marriage itself, which is actualized in sexual congress, which unites spouses biologically and thus personally. The traditional view rejects the instrumentalization of sex, and thus of the bodies of sexual partners, to any extrinsic end. Now, this does not mean that procreation and pleasure are not rightly sought in marital acts. It does mean, though, that they are rightly sought when they are integrated with the basic good and justifying point of marital sex, namely the one-flesh, multi-level union of marriage itself. And only that can explain the features of our marital law, including the features that are not in dispute today, at least among most people. Like marriage really is a sexual partnership and not tennis playing. That to have a marriage, you can only have two people. You can't have 3 or 5 or 7 as a group. It's necessary, therefore, for critics of traditional matrimonial law to argue that the apparent one-flesh unity that distinguishes marital acts from sodomitical acts is illusory, and that the apparent bodily communion of spouses in procreative-type acts, which according to the traditional view forms the biological matrix of their marital relationship, is not really possible. Well, on the question of reproductive behavior, or better, the idea of procreative-type acts, acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation, it's important to see, and folks on the other side often just ignore this, that identical behavior can cause conception or not, depending entirely on whether the non-behavioral conditions of procreation happen to obtain. And the intrinsic and not merely instrumental good of marital communion gives spouses reason to fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation, even in circumstances in which they know the non-behavioral conditions do not obtain. This is true precisely inasmuch as the fulfillment of those conditions is interpersonally unitive. It renews the marriage. It expresses the marriage in its fullness. So the question is a two-in-one-flesh communion possible, or is it best merely a metaphor? And I think there the argument that I articulated from Grisey earlier really just settles the case. It is no mere metaphor. It's part of the real substance of human living between a man and a woman bound together in marriage. It seems to me a plain biological fact, as Grisey says, that reproduction is a single function, yet it's carried out not by an individual male or female human being, but by a male and female as a mated pair. So in respect of reproduction, albeit not in other respects, again like locomotion or digestion, the mated pair is a single reproductive unit. The partners form a single principle. And if that biological unit is a personal unit, because the body is not a mere extrinsic instrument, but part of the personal reality of the human being, then bingo. Argument's over. Still, Macedo claims that the one-flesh communion of sterile couples, and I quote him, would appear to be more a matter of appearance than reality, unquote. Because of their sterility, he contends, such couples really cannot unite biologically. Quote him again, their bodies, like those of homosexuals, can form no single reproductive principle, no real unity. So you see where the argument is now. It's not about whether love makes a family. It's about whether, in fact, two persons, a man and woman, can unite and found their relationship, their multi-level sharing of life, on true biological organic unity, uniting at that level of their being as persons. Indeed, Macedo argues that even fertile couples who conceive children in acts of sexual intercourse do not truly unite biologically because, he asserts, penises and vaginas do not unite biologically, sperm and eggs do. Well, John Finnis has replied, I think, quite aptly and devastatingly. I quote Finnis, and he's here criticizing Macedo, "In this reductivist word-legislating mood, one might declare that sperm and egg unite only physically, and only their pronuclei are biologically united. But it would be more realistic," Finnis continues, "to acknowledge that the whole process of copulation, involving as it does the brains of the man and the woman, their nerves and blood and secretions and coordinated activity, is biological through and through," unquote, as indeed it is. Moreover, as Finnis points out, the organic unity which is instantiated in acts of the reproductive kind is not, as Macedo reductively imagines, the unity of penis and vagina. It is the unity of the persons in the intentional, consensual act of seminal emission or reception in the woman's reproductive tract. It's the act of fulfilling the behavioral conditions of procreation, of uniting as a man and a woman. The unity to which Finnis refers, this unity of body, sense, emotion, reason, and will, is in my view central to our understanding of humanness itself. And as I say, helps to explain for those of us who are opposed why we are opposed to taking human life, either by abortion or infanticide on the one end or by euthanasia on the other. Yet it's a unity which Macedo and others who deny the possibility of true marital communion can simply give no account of. For this denial presupposes a dualism of person, considered as conscious and desiring self on the one hand, and body, considered as a mere extrinsic instrument of the conscious and desiring self, on the other hand, which is flatly incompatible with this unity. This dualism is central to Macedo's denial of the possibility of one-flesh marital communion, that sodomitical acts differ from what I've described as acts of the procreative type only as a matter of arranging what he calls the plumbing. So he says, look, the only difference between a married couple and a same-sex couple is the arrangement of the plumbing. According to this idea, the genital organs of an infertile woman, and of course most women are infertile most of the time, or of an infertile man, are really not reproductive organs at all. I mean, this is where they're driven to by the argument, right? They've got to go there if I press them. And they do. I mean, they can feel the pressure of the argument. They say, okay, look, once you've got sterility, what look like reproductive organs are just not reproductive organs, any more than, say, mouths or rectums or tongues or fingers are reproductive organs. Thus, the intercourse of a man and a woman where at least one partner is temporarily or permanently infertile cannot really be, Macedo says, an act of the reproductive type. But the plain fact is that the genitals of men and women are reproductive organs all the time, even during periods of sterility, and acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreations are acts of the procreative type, generative acts, even where the non-behavioral conditions of procreation happen not to obtain, as most of the time they do not. Most of a woman's cycle, the couple are incapable of conceiving a child. Insofar as the point or object of sexual intercourse is marital union, the partners achieve the desired unity. They become one flesh, and not merely metaphorically, a biological unit, precisely insofar as they mate. That is, fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation. Well, that's true even of animals as well. I mean, I have a wonderful friend at Princeton who's a zoologist. He's the world's greatest authority on zebras. And my friend can tell, in fact, most of us could tell, even without training, when the zebras have mated and when they have failed to mate, even if there was an attempt. Maybe the female rebuffed the male. And he knows that a certain biological process is going on there, and that a certain biological unity is affected between the zebras when they've successfully mated, that isn't affected when there's been a failure to mate. Of course, the difference between humans and zebras is whether they're persons. We don't worry about sexual morality in zebras because they're not persons. They don't make choices. They don't have free will. They don't have human dignity. But we do. and that dignity pertains to our bodies and not just to our emotions and our consciousness, precisely because the body is part of the personal reality of the human being. Now, Macedo considers the possibility that defenders of the traditional understanding of marriage are right about all this, that marriage truly is a one-flesh union consummated and actualized by marital acts, that sodomitical and other intrinsically non-marital sexual acts really are self-alienating and as such immoral, that the true conception of marriage is one according to which it is an intrinsically heterosexual and monogamous relationship. But even if the traditional understanding of marriage is the morally correct one, even if it's true, he argues, the state cannot justly recognize it as such. For if disagreements about the nature of marriage lie in, he says, difficult philosophical quarrels about which reasonable people have long disagreed, then our differences lie in precisely the territory that the philosopher John Rawls rightly marks off as inappropriate to the fashioning of our basic rights and liberties. So he says, even if you guys are right about all this, even if you believers in the historic conjugal definition of marriage, LDS, Catholics, evangelicals, even if you guys are right about all this, still the law should redefine marriage as to accommodate same-sex partnerships and perhaps other kinds of partnerships, because your argument depends on controversial philosophical premises. And from this, he says, it follows that government must remain neutral as between competing conceptions of marriage as intrinsically heterosexual and conceptions according to which marriages may be contracted not only between a man and a woman, but also between two men or two women, and presumably a man or a woman in a multiple-party union. Otherwise, according to Macedo, the state would inappropriately be denying people fundamental aspects of equality, there comes equality again, based on reasons and arguments whose force can only be appreciated by those who accept difficult-to-assess metaphysical and moral claims. Well, it seems to me that something very much like the contrary is true. I think he's got this exactly wrong, 180 degrees. Because the true meaning, value, and significance of marriage are fairly easily grasped, even if people sometimes have difficulty living up to its moral demands, where a culture, including judge a legal culture, promotes and supports a sound understanding of marriage, both formally and informally, and because ideologies and practices which are hostile to marriage, to a sound understanding of practice in marriage, and practice of marriage in a culture, tend to undermine the institution of marriage in that culture, as we've seen all too well, thus making it difficult for large numbers of people to grasp the true meaning and value and significance of marriage. It is extremely important that government abandon attempts to be neutral with regard to competing conception of marriage and try very hard to embody in law and public policy the morally soundest conception. There are consequences to trying to achieve neutrality. Those consequences are illustrated by what Brad has shown us today in the social science research. Moreover, any effort to achieve neutrality will inevitably prove self-defeating, for the law is a teacher. And it will teach either that marriage is an intrinsic human good that people can choose to participate in, but whose contours people cannot make and remake at will, or the law will teach that marriage is a mere convention which is malleable in such a way that individuals, couples, or even groups can choose to make of it whatever their desires, interests, and subjective goals would demand. The result, given the undeniable prejudices and biases of human sexual psychology, which we all know too well, will be the development of practices and ideologies that truly do tend to undermine the sound understanding of and practice of marriage in a culture, together with the pathologies that tend to reinforce the very practices and ideologies that cause them. You really get a vicious circle going. Another of my Oxford teachers, Joseph Raz, though himself a liberal who does not share my view about homosexuality or sexual morality generally, is rightly critical of forms of liberalism, including Rawlsian liberalism, which suppose that law and government can and should be neutral with respect to competing conceptions of morality. In this regard, he has noted that monogamy, assuming that it's the only valuable form of marriage, cannot be practiced by an individual. It requires a culture which recognizes it and which supports it through the public's attitude and through its formal institutions. Now, Raz does not suppose that in a culture whose law and public morality do not support monogamy or exclusivity, someone who happens to believe in these ideals will somehow be unable to restrict himself to having only one sexual partner, or will be required to take on additional ones. His point, rather, is that even if these ideals are sound elements of an understanding of marriage, large numbers of people will fail to understand that or why that is the case, and will therefore fail to grasp the value of these ideals and their intelligible point, unless they are assisted by a culture that suggests or supports formally and informally marriage in line with these ideals. And what is true of these ideals is equally true of other marks or aspects of a morally sound understanding of marriage. In other words, marriage is the type of good that can be participated in or fully participated in only by people who, at least at some basic level, understand it and choose it with a proper understanding in mind. Marriage is a different kind of good from a lot of other goods. You cannot understand what health is, but if you've got it, you've got it. You may be just blessed with it. You may get it because you love athletics and one of the side effects is health. You've got it. But marriage is a different kind of good. It can only be participated in by people who have, at some basic level, it doesn't have to be a fancy philosophical thing, but at some basic level an understanding of what it is. And that's why so many marriages go bad, because people go into them not having the slightest idea what they're committing themselves to. So people's proper, and yet, so it can only be participated in by people who have some basic understanding of it, yet people's ability properly to understand it and thus to choose it, to participate in it, depends on institutions and cultural understandings that transcend individual choice. The culture either makes marriage available to people or not. It's a libertarian fantasy to believe that culture doesn't matter at all, law doesn't matter at all. People are just free to choose whether to be married or not. In that false utopia, no one would be married, because the understanding of marriage necessary to support the institution would simply not exist. But what about Macedo's claim that when matrimonial law deviates from neutrality by embodying the moral judgment that marriage is inherently between a man and a woman, it denies same-sex partners who wish to marry fundamental aspects of equality? Does a due regard for equality require moral neutrality? There, in the end, is what the argument comes down to. The appeal to equality is rhetorically useful to Macedo and other proponents of liberal sexual ideology, but does no real work in their argument. That's the point I want to drive home. If the moral judgment that marriage is inherently between persons of opposite sexes, a man and a woman, is false, then the reason for recognizing same-sex marriages is that such unions are, as a matter of moral fact, indistinguishable from marriages of the traditional type. If, however, the moral judgment that marriage is inherently an opposite-sex union is true, then Macedo's claim that the recognition of this truth by government denies persons fundamental aspects of equality simply cannot be sustained. If, in other words, the marital acts of spouses consummate and actualize their marriage as a one-flesh communion and serve thereby as the biological matrix of the relationship of marriage at all its levels, then the embodiment in law and public policy of an understanding of marriage as inherently the union of a man and a woman denies no one fundamental aspects of equality. It's true that persons who are exclusively and strongly homosexually oriented may lack a psychological prerequisite to enter into marital relationships, but this is no fault of the law. Indeed, the law would embody a lie, and a damaging one, insofar as it would contribute to the undermining of the sound understanding and practice of marriage in a culture if it were to pretend, and it would be a pretense, that a marital relationship could be formed on the basis of and integrated around sodomitical and other intrinsically non-marital acts. It is certainly unjust arbitrarily to deny legal marriage to persons who are capable of performing marital acts and entering into the marital relationship. So, for example, laws forbidding interracial marriages truly were violations of equality. Contrary to the published claims of Andrew Sullivan, Andrew Koppelman, and others, however, that laws embodying the judgment that marriage is intrinsically between a man and a woman are in no way analogous to laws against miscegenation. Laws forbidding whites to marry blacks were unjust, not because they embodied a particular moral view, and thus violated the alleged requirement of moral neutrality, but rather they were unjust because they embodied an unsound, indeed grotesquely false moral view, one that was racist and as such immoral. That was simply an expression of a larger system in which blacks were put into a subordinate position under an ideology of white supremacy. Nothing like that is an issue in the current debate. Macedo makes clear his opposition to what he calls excesses of sexual permissiveness and promiscuity. He says that the reasonable core of the conservative sexual teaching is its concern with promiscuity and sexual license. He proposes not an alteration, he says, in the meaning of marriage or an abandonment of its constitutive norms of monogamy, fidelity, and permanence of commitment, but merely an extension of the opportunity to marry to persons who have hitherto been, as he puts it, excluded. However, it is a standing challenge to Macedo and other defenders of his view. And this challenge we reiterated, together with my co-authors, I reiterated in What is Marriage? To provide a principled moral ground for the norms of exclusivity, fidelity, and permanence that are compatible with their rejection of the traditional conception of marriage as a one-flesh union. I don't doubt that Stephen Macedo personally disapproves of promiscuity and open marriages and so forth, anonymous sex or sex with animals and things like that. But there are more free-thinking liberals who do not object to those things. They believe that so long as care is taken to prevent unwanted pregnancy and the transmission of disease, sexual relations between any two or more persons who, without deception, consent to enjoy an encounter together is morally innocent and even good. On the account of sexual morality Macedo offers, in defending the idea of same-sex marriage, it's simply impossible to say why these people are wrong. Certainly, the essentially prudential considerations Macedo mentions in favor of sexual self-restraint are insufficient to the moral task. The question is not one of his or anyone else's subjective scruples or even prudential concerns about rampant or anarchic sexuality. It has to do rather with the objective logical implications of his rejection of the principles of traditional sexual morality in marriage, implications that are clear enough not only to conservatives like me, but more importantly, to rigorously consistent liberals as well, who say, what's the problem? If it feels good, do it. No harm, no foul. If in fact the rejection of traditional conceptions of marriage undercuts the grounds of moral principle for upholding marriage's constitutive norms, then the case for so-called same-sex marriage collapses as anything more than an effort to undermine the institution of marriage from within, an effort that some activists in the cause of redefining marriage to include same-sex partnerships expressly endorse in publications targeted to audiences likely to be sympathetic to their agenda. If you haven't read David Blankenhorn's fine book, The Future of Marriage, it's worth reading for lots of reasons, but it would be worth reading for that one alone. He bothered to look at the literature within the homosexual subculture itself and found case after case of people saying, trying to get same-sex marriage is a great idea because that will undermine the institution of marriage, which is a horrid, patriarchal, terrible, retrograde institution that hangs people up and holds people back and prevents the free expression of their personality, and that we'd be better off rid of. It's a step along the way. It's not something you hear said out loud in the general debate. They weren't putting it on television in California. But Blankenhorn was smart to look at what is said behind the curtain when people are just talking to each other. Perhaps sensing their vulnerability on this most critical of points, promoters of what has sometimes been described as the conservative case for gay marriage sometimes fall back on stereotypes of their critics as bigots who foster discrimination against their fellow citizens and seek to deny them equality. This is what we were all tarred with, the church was tarred with, in the aftermath of Prop 8. This is worse than unfortunate. It's appalling. It's wrong. Defenders of the traditional conception of marriage and sexual morality have stated their challenge to the folks on the other side fairly and clearly. That challenge is to show us how the norms that are generally accepted, even today, such as marriage being between two people in a sexual partnership, show us how those norms are consistent with your desire to eliminate sexual complementarity as essential to marriage. We've stated the challenge fairly. I've had it out there for 10 years. We've renewed it in What is Marriage. We've heard back nothing. If they can meet our challenge, let them do it. Thank you.
I have to say at the outset, my voice is weak. Last night it was gimmered. But I'm honored to share the podium with Professors George and Carey, but I confess that I have no formal training in moral philosophy, and I lack the ability to engage either of them intelligibly in an open forum on this important topic. And because I have a strong aversion to public embarrassment, I will discuss the merits of their remarks in the relative privacy of our dinner this evening. Now, although I don't recall Rich Williams providing an explanation for why he wanted a federal appeals court judge involved in this discussion, I'm assuming it is an acknowledgement that courts in the United States have been called upon of late to pass upon the definitions of marriage that have emerged from the legislative process. By a coincidence that Professor Williams could not have known, I am the author of an essay on the role of federal judges that appears in the same issue of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, as does Professor George's article, What is Marriage? I have little doubt, however, which piece will generate the most interest. My brief response to Professor George today will draw upon that essay, which was titled, Was Bork Right About Judges? By the way, the answer is yes, he was. Let me begin with a story that took place a few steps from here. It was the day after I had been confirmed to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. I was in my office as general counsel of BYU on the third floor of the administration building, and it was a happy day. President Samuelson was happy because it marked my departure soon thereafter. I was fielding congratulatory calls from friends around the nation. It was very nice. And one in particular, who I had been a partner with at a law firm in Washington, D.C., called. And he said, good, congratulations, Tom. He said, can I give you some advice? And I said, I am open and teachable. Give me advice. He said, well, you know, I used to clerk for Judge X on the D.C. Circuit, and I clerked for Justice Y on the Supreme Court, and I've been a pretty careful observer of judges over the years. So let me tell you how I think you ought to go about doing your job. He said, and I'll share with you the advice that Judge X gave me the first day I clerked in his chambers on the D.C. Circuit. He brought me into his room and he said, I won't give you this fellow's name, he said, here's how we go about doing our job. The first thing that we do is we learn the facts of the case as best we can. These are real people and our decisions have consequences on their lives. The second thing that we do is we think long and hard about what's the just result. What's the fair result? What's the right thing to do? And then we go find law to support our decision. Well, the purpose of his call was congratulatory. It was not to engage me in a discussion of the role of a judge under our Constitution, but I took a vow that day when I hung up the phone that I would never, ever follow his advice. And so now when my law clerks come to my chambers on their first day, they hear that story. And then they hear the explanation of why we will never follow the second part of that advice. In our system, we, the people, determine the values that govern society, and they express those values in laws enacted by politically accountable representatives in the Constitution, in acts of Congress, and by actions of the executive based either on the authority granted it in the Constitution or delegated to it by Congress. The role of the judge is not to determine what the governing value shall be, but to apply the value chosen by we the people. And if I am reading his work correctly, Professor George agrees with me on this point. In his 2008 essay in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, titled Natural Law, he wrote, natural law theory treats the role of the judge as itself fundamentally a matter for determinatio and not for direct translation from the natural law. Accordingly, it does not presuppose that the judge enjoys or should enjoy as a matter of natural law a plenary authority to substitute his own understanding of the requirements of the natural law for that of the lawmaker in deciding cases at law. On the contrary, the rule of law morally requires that it obligates, as a matter of natural law, the judge to respect the limits of his own authority as it has been allocated to him by way of an authoritative determinatio. Professor Brett Scharfs of BYU's law school describes the judge's role this way, quote, "Following the law places the judge in a role that is in large part clerical, where he labors largely as a functionary, applying and implementing the law. To be sure," Professor Scharfs writes, "the volume, variety, and complexity of the issues that a judge encounters make his work difficult, but the judge's primary task is to find and follow the law." The recent confirmation hearings of both Justice Sotomayor and Kagan contained repeated iterations of this view. You may remember Justice Sotomayor's confirmation hearing had a dicey issue to deal with because she had been quoted at a gathering such as this, and therefore I'm very careful about what we say, a gathering such as this about that a wise Latina would be especially qualified to rule on the law, and the president in his campaign for the presidency talked about the need for empathetic judges, and then Judge Sotomayor was asked directly about those points of views, and here's what she said. She ran away from them. She said her duty was simple: fidelity to the law. The task of a judge is not to make law; it is to apply the law. Dean Kagan, now Justice Kagan, adopted a similar approach in her confirmation hearing. When Senator Kyle asked her if she agreed with the scholar's assessment that the law only decides 90% of a given case, she disagreed, and she replied, "It's the law all the way down." Describing her method of constitutional interpretation, she stated that, quote, "If it's a constitutional question, it's what the text of the Constitution says. It's what the history says, the structure, the precedent, but what the law says, not what a judge's personal view is." Now, why do I mention all this? Because the current litigation over California's Proposition 8, I think, illustrates the role, the proper role of a judge in our system on the issue of how our laws define marriage. Plaintiffs claim that Proposition 8, though an expression of a determination by the California electorate about what marriage is, actually contravenes values already chosen by we the people and expressed in the federal Constitution, which is the supreme law of the nation. In particular, plaintiffs argue, and the district court agreed with them, that Proposition 8 contravenes two provisions of the 14th Amendment. First, the one that says no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And second, the provision that says no state shall deprive any person of liberty without due process of law. The plaintiffs claim that a law that limits state recognition of marriage to heterosexual monogamous relationships and denies it to same-sex relationships violates those clauses, violates those value choices made by we the people and expressed in the Constitution. They claim that Proposition 8 violates the Equal Protection Clause in two ways and the Due Process Clause in at least one way. About the Equal Protection Clause, the Supreme Court has said that there must be a rational basis for treating persons and groups differently from one another. Plaintiffs argued that there is no rational basis for treating same-sex relationships differently than heterosexual relationships, and the district court agreed. Secondly, the Supreme Court has told us that laws that treat differently certain groups, what are called discrete and insular minorities, that have been the target of invidious discrimination and who have been unable to adequately protect themselves through the political process, violate the Equal Protection Clause unless the state can show that there's a compelling interest to make those distinctions. Laws that discriminate based on race or gender are the primary examples of such suspect litigation. The Supreme Court has not yet determined that sexual orientation falls within that category. The district court concluded that it does. Finally, the third argument that they make based on the Constitution is under the Due Process Clause. The Supreme Court has said that fundamental liberties can only be restricted by the state if there is compelling government reason to do so. The plaintiffs in the Proposition 8 case argue that same-sex couples have a fundamental liberty to have the state confer the benefits of marriage on them. The Supreme Court has recognized that the right to heterosexual, monogamous marriage is, in fact, a fundamental liberty. The Proposition 8 litigation seems to be able to be a vehicle to present the Supreme Court with the opportunity to determine whether the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment extends to same-sex couples. The district court here, in this case, held that it does. Now, how does a judge go about resolving these competing claims? A judge who plays well his part in our constitutional system will strive to find and then apply the value chosen by we the people and expressed in the Constitution. One thing that judge may not do is base his decision on his own understanding of the natural law or some other guide to right and wrong, but rather on the value chosen by we the people and enshrined in the Constitution. Thank you.
Just marvelous to hear the response and to hear Professor George speaking. I want to express personal gratitude for your visit to Brigham Young University and my own personal thanks. I was a visiting fellow at Professor George's Institute a few years ago and got to know him then and have had a good and fruitful relationship since then. I am but a humble scholar. Chaucer says, "Gladly would he learn and gladly would he teach." And I'm particularly in the gladly would he learn mode. I'm not a distinguished judge, and I'm certainly not in my comments going to out jurisprudence, the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. So what can I possibly have to add to the conversation in comment? I guess in some ways, I'm the soup that is served. When I thought of the paper, this now world-famous paper, What is Marriage, it reminded me of something that happened in the late 18th century in Berlin. There was an essay contest, and the question was, what is enlightenment? And this contest brought together some of the greatest minds of the day, the Orthodox Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, the great Christian pastor Gottfried Herder, and the philosopher Immanuel Kant, amongst others. And they submitted their essays to define this term. What we now have is a legacy of those essays and the definition of what is enlightenment. And people go back to those essays, scholars do today, to note here was a time when they turned their minds to this important question. And that's what I feel Professor George has done with his two students. Turn their mind to a significant, incredibly important issue of our day and attempted civilly and reasonably to define a term, to define something that maybe was self-understood, but now we've come to need to define this. One cannot help but wonder how many torturous debates on this subject, as well as others, could become clarified and made more productive if this simple step were to be taken to define terms. In fact, this is one of the chief problems when attempting to engage in reasonable discussion and civil debate on the subject of marriage. What Professor George points out is that revisionists have only rarely and vaguely explained what they think marriage is. What he's done in the article is to answer a question that is asked as recently as December 2010 in the New York Times. Russ Douthat asks, the long-running culture war arguments about how to structure family life. Should marriage be reserved for heterosexuals? Is abstinence or safe sex the most responsible way to navigate the premarital landscape? Look increasingly irrelevant further down the educational ladder, where sex and child-rearing often take place in the absence of any social structures at all. This, in turn, may be remembered as the great tragedy of the culture war, while college-educated Americans battle over what marriage should mean, much of the country may be abandoning the institution entirely. That's the way the article ends, and it seems to end on this note of, why are you doing this? Why are you coming out to Brigham Young University, speaking at the Wheatley Institution about these core institutions? Look what's happening on the ground to the rest of the country. To that, Professor George gave an answer that I have on a piece of paper right over here.
Dying to know what it is.
It's one that he actually quoted in his own lecture, but it came at the end, and I think it's worth repeating here. It is something that I think answers this question. Why do this? Why have a university? Why have a place where we come to talk about terms and define things like marriage? He mentioned, and he's published this, the law is a teacher. It will teach either that marriage is a reality in which people can choose to participate, but whose contours people cannot make and remake at will. For instance, a one-flesh communion of persons united in a form of life uniquely suitable to the generation, education, and nurturing of children. Or the law will teach that marriage is a mere convention, which is malleable in such a way that individuals, couples, or indeed groups can choose to make of it whatever suits their desires, interests, or subjective goals. The result, given the biases of human sexual psychology, will be the development of practices and ideologies that truly tend to undermine the sound understanding and practice of marriage, together with the development of pathologies that tend to reinforce the very practices and ideologies that cause them. So if we don't have a university and a place where we talk about these ideas and define terms, we'll actually be contributing to the very things that Russ Douthat says are occurring. So we need a place like this. And I'm glad to be a faculty member at Brigham Young University where we can discuss these things and talk about them. In fact, one of the questions earlier in the day, we looked at the proclamation to the world and the family from the First Presidency and the Council of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We read about the orientation of marriage to family and to children. Maybe one of the questions, Professor George, that I would pose is actually what came to my mind was a talk that Elder Perry gave, and I'm on very thin ice with Elder Perry in the room, so I better get this right. He mentioned in this talk being on an airplane. I think he was traveling from perhaps Europe. He was certainly talking to somebody, I believe, from Europe or Eastern Europe. They were talking about the problems of the day and what was going on. And the question came up of population, reproduction. And the gentleman with whom he spoke didn't seem to have a conception that if marriage is not about children, then there is no future. So one of my questions is, we understand, the Catholic Church understands this, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints understands it. Why is it difficult to convey that message sometimes to a broader public? How can people go on and not necessarily see this point? Just as a small question. Also, I wanted to continue. You've mentioned that the marital sexual act, when performed with morally upright intentions, is not a mere symbol of love or affection, nor a mere means to procreation. Rather, it embodies or makes present the intrinsic human good of marital union. As I've reflected on that statement, I couldn't help but think of something that has come from one of my own church's leaders, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland, in which he writes, "We simply must understand the revealed, restored Latter-day Saint doctrine of the soul and the high and inextricable part the body plays in that doctrine. one of the plain and precious truths restored to this dispensation is that, quote, the spirit and the body are the soul of man, and he adds, and woman, and that when the spirit and body are separated, men and women cannot receive a fullness of joy. He explains that, and I quote him here again, human intimacy, that sacred physical union ordained of God for a married couple, deals with a symbol that demands special sanctity. Such an act of love between a man and a woman is, or certainly was ordained to be, a symbol of total union. And this reminds me of your definition of a comprehensive, multi-level union. Union of their hearts, their hopes, their lives, their love, their family, their future, their everything. It is a symbol that we try to suggest in the temple with a word like seal. And your comments about the Vatican's view of, is it burnish and purify?
Freed from stain.
Freed from stain. The prophet Joseph Smith once said, we perhaps ought to render such a sacred bond as welding, that those united in matrimony and eternal families are welded together, inseparable, if you will, to withstand the temptations of the adversary and the afflictions of mortality. In fact, what you noticed by President Ezra Taft Benson, the quotation on the resurrection, reminded me that in your own Cambridge University Press book, I'm not quite sure how you got them to accept it. You have a section here on the resurrection of the body. In fact, it's several pages long. And I thought of this, and you cite St. Paul from the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 12, and then verses 16 through 19 on the resurrection, as well as the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And it made me think of my own faith and the testimony of the prophet Joseph Smith. And you made me wonder about something when you said that all of our goods will be purified with us in the resurrection. And then it struck me. As you know, in our faith, we believe that families are a good, that marriage, as you've argued so many times, is a good, and that in the resurrection, through ordinances that are performed in the temple by the power of the priesthood, we have the opportunity and the privilege of having that good with us then and there as well. And you helped me to get a renewed look at that. That's one of the things, too, that will be purified and burnished. And this might surprise you because I'm not sure that you know about this. One of the things that the prophet Joseph Smith said was that our social relations, and I know in various places you've talked about the intrinsic good of friendship, sociability. He says that too rises with us. And I can only imagine what that would be like to be in a purified, burnished state, all of the good of those relationships. I'll close here with, again, just quoting Elder Holland. The external symbol of that union, the physical manifestation of what is a far deeper spiritual and metaphysical bonding, is the physical blending that is part of, indeed, a most beautiful and gratifying expression of that larger, more complete union of eternal purpose and promise. As delicate as it is to mention, I nevertheless trust your maturity to understand that physiologically, we are created as men and women to fit together in such a union, in this ultimate physical expression of one man and one woman. They are as nearly and as literally one as two separate physical bodies can ever be. It is the act of ultimate physical intimacy we most nearly fulfill the commandment of the Lord given to Adam and Eve, living symbols for all married couples, when he invited them to cleave unto one another only and thus become one flesh. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Judge, and thank you, Professor Carey. Very interesting remarks. Judge Griffiths and I are on exactly the same page when it comes to judicial philosophy. It's the task of the judge to interpret and to apply the law and not to make the law. And in so many cases, we're in the soup today because judges have not followed that philosophy. They've taken the bad advice that was given to Judge Griffiths and that he wisely rejected and teaches his law clerks to reject. It undermines the very principle of the rule of law for a judge to act lawlessly. And what Judge Griffiths was being advised by his no doubt well-intentioned friend to do was essentially to become a law unto himself, the very definition of lawlessness. And down that road is the road to chaos. That, of course, is what gave us Roe versus Wade, the tragic decision legalizing the killing of unborn children in our culture. And it has given us so many horrendous Supreme Court decisions. But it would be wrong even if it didn't bear that responsibility, even if the decisions would have been, from a policy point of view, good decisions. It's wrong because it's a usurpation of the authority of those duly empowered under the Constitution to make decisions about how we will order our lives together. And it falls to them to make their best judgment, informed by faith and reason of what morality requires, their best judgment of natural law. An error that I sought to correct in the 2008 article that Judge Griffiths kindly quoted was the error of supposing that if there is a natural law, then somehow automatically judges enjoy a plenary authority to override legislators or presidents or governors and to just make the law up themselves. So what we need to do, I think, in the choosing and confirming of justices is really to find people who are prepared to do what Judge Griffiths is prepared to do, which is to live by the law whether he happens to like the law or not, to enforce the Constitution and its requirements, quite irrespective of whether he would like to see that Constitution amended. Now, the judge was right to quote Judge Sotomayor and Judge Kagan as agreeing with us about that, as rejecting the judicial philosophy that is openly advocated not only by Judge Griffiths' friend, but also by most law professors today, if I can be very candid. While he was right to quote their agreement with us rather than with their colleagues, it's important to understand that we don't need lip service here. There have been lots of judges who've sworn allegiance to the Constitution. There have been lots of judges who've said, look, my job is to interpret and apply the law and not to make the law, and I will respect the will of the people as embodied in the acts of the legislature, and I will go by the text of the Constitution and its structure and original understanding and not simply treat it as a license for me to range abroad and do justice as I see fit. But then those very justices will turn around and once they occupy the seat for life with no possibility of being removed, then behave as if they are platonic guardians, schoolmarms, people who have authority over us rather than our servants whose task it is to faithfully apply the law. So we need good judges, and we need good judges especially at the level of the Supreme Court of the United States. And I have a candidate. Paul Carey, what a great friend Paul is, and I thank Paul for his remarks. As a matter of fact, Paul, I had seen Elder Holland's article. His son Matt, my great friend, president of Utah Valley University. I'm so proud to say, as I know you are. He's a son of Brigham Young, but he's also a son of the James Madison program at Princeton, and we're all proud of Matt. Matt sent me a copy of his father's wonderful piece, and I was resonating with it down the line and saying, amen, amen, brother. The one point on which someone might think that Jeffrey Holland and I disagree on that, philosophically, is on his use of the word symbol, the idea of marital communion as symbolizing the deeper relationship. I would prefer the word constituting. But that's because in secular philosophical discourse, the word symbol has now come to mean merely a symbol. So it's distinguished from the reality of the thing. There's the reality of the marriage, and there's that which symbolizes it. And I think Elder Holland is using it in the much more traditional sense, the sense in which in the Catholic Church we talk of sacraments as symbols, not to mean that they're not real, but to mean that they have a kind of public and open significance, that they tell us something about the
It's
reality.
Souls, Symbols, and Sacraments, the actual title.
Yeah,
So it's-
yeah, exactly right. So I think that his point is absolutely right, and I'd love to see that piece, because it's very readable, very readable. I'd love to see that piece distributed to LDS young people, because there's a profound understanding of marriage that is just right on the mark that is there. So I think it would empower young people, and it's spoken, of course, from the family, from the tradition of LDS faith. So I think it will really resonate with LDS young people, and it will not only enable them, I think, more effectively to make the case for marriage, because our LDS young people need to be apostles for marriage. They need to be out there making the case, not only to their fellow LDS, but to the whole culture. Not only to make the case, but also to live out the fullness and richness of marriage in their own lives. It's a beautiful and wonderful piece, Paul, and I thank you for calling it to your attention. Now, while I have the microphone, and before we go to Q&A, I want to go all the way back to Professor Carey's presentation this morning, because it's something I was dying to say, and I'll say it now. And that is, he called our attention to something really important from a historical point of view. And when we read history, when we learn about history, we need to keep this in mind. Much of what we take for granted as history is simply propaganda. History is written not necessarily by the victors so much as by the folks who command the high points of the culture, the elites, right? Now that's great when you have an intellectually healthy elite that's really dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge and truth and is not all caught up in ideology and so forth. But when you have an elite, an intellectual elite that's got an agenda, that's got a moral and political agenda, and I don't care what that agenda is, conservative or liberal, then you've got to be very skeptical. And this is nothing new. And Paul Carey's paper this morning made it plain that it's nothing new. Much that we think we know about the Middle Ages and even about the so-called Dark Ages, much that we think we know to be true is actually false. And the very best example, and Paul, you can incorporate this into your paper because it buttresses the very points you make. The best example I can think of is the invention of the flat earth. Do you know the book by Jeffrey Burton Russell, Paul? The Invention of the Flat Earth. It's a wonderful work of history. Now, we have all been told, have we not, that the medievals, poor benighted fools that they were, ignorant people, all believed that the earth was flat, right? If I ask you, what did the medievals believe about the earth? I mean, did they think the earth was spherical as we know it to be, or did they think it was flat? Most of us, and I certainly would have said before I read The Invention of the Flat Earth, that, oh yeah, they thought it was flat, but scientific knowledge moved on, and we came to work out that it was actually spherical. Well, I don't know what might be the case about the folk wisdom of the Middle Ages, but any decently educated, even half-educated person in the Middle Ages actually knew that the earth was spherical. In fact, just to take the example of the greatest intellectual of the time, whose views were very widely accepted in short order after his death, if not during his lifetime, Thomas Aquinas, who was mentioned, I think, by Brad earlier today. Aquinas has no less than 4 proofs in his writings that the earth is spherical and not flat. Now, you might ask, yeah, but he probably has those proofs in there because so many people believed it was flat that he thought he had to prove to them that it was spherical. No. It turns out that if you look at where he proves from eclipses and from other phenomena the sphericity of the earth, he's doing so using it as an example to illustrate the point that things are not always what they appear. So, for example, you use another example. You put a stick in water, a straight stick in water, and it looks like it's bent, but you pull it out, and it turns out to be straight. And it didn't change when it was in the water into being crooked. What he's giving is a defense of the idea of science, investigating appearances to see what the what the reality is. And so he is taking it for granted that his readers all know that the earth is spherical. And he's showing how it is that we prove it to be the case in various ways. He thinks there are various ways to prove it. So then the next question obviously becomes, well, why are we all under the impression that the medieval, it turns out we're the ignorant ones, how is it that we think that the medievals all believed that the earth was flat? And in Burton Russell's book, what he shows is that some leaders of the Enlightenment, especially those who are kind of hostile to traditional religious faith, who were very eager to depict everything about the past as benighted and retrograde and ignorance and sort of mired down in ignorance, they simply defamed their predecessors, claiming that these fools believed that the earth was flat. It was just a slander, and in the prosecution of an agenda, in order to undermine the religious and moral heritage that they wanted to reject. They take a matter of empirical scientific fact and try to discredit the believers in the moral and religious teachings with the allegation that they were fools who don't even know the empirical truth about the shape of the earth. So you can add that, Paul, to your armory there of facts about how historians sometimes distort history in the pursuit of an agenda. So keep a critical intellect when it comes to everything, including history. Yeah.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes for questions, and I guess I'm the arbitrator of how long we really have. But we'd like to invite those of you, especially give our students the first shot. We've had students with us all day. They've earned the right to ask a couple questions. And then feel free to direct your question to any member of the panel, and we'll manage this process for just a few minutes. We only have time for a couple questions, and then we need to move on. And again, please use the microphone.
My question's for Professor George. You've emphasized the performance of copulation or acts of procreative type as being intrinsic to marriage. What can be said about men who are not only infertile, but who due to damage to their genitalia cannot perform acts of procreative type and hence consummate and actualize a marriage? And in your view, can such men be participants in natural one-flesh marriage as you define it?
Yeah. The way our law has traditionally handled what are sometimes called Josephite marriages, and that refers to the marriage of Joseph and Mary, which according to Catholic teaching, I'm not sure what LDS belief is on this, but according to Catholic teaching, Joseph and Mary had an unconsummated marriage, so they're sometimes called Josephite marriages. That, in Catholic teaching, is a result of the vocation of the spouses, the specific vocation of Mary and Joseph, a God-given vocation. But it could be not a matter of vocation, but rather a matter of physical incapacity. The way our law has traditionally dealt with that is to treat those marriages as true marriages, but as annullable. That is, because they're incomplete and haven't been sealed, if the marriage is to be broken, a divorce is actually not required. Because it's incomplete, it can be annulled. Now, different jurisdictions handle the specifics of that differently. Some seem to have no statute of limitations on it. So a spouse, either spouse, can come and seek a declaration of nullity of marriage on grounds of non-consummation at any point. Other jurisdictions have statutes of limitation. The one that I can think of, I think it's the state of Georgia, had it as a 5-year thing. You got 5 years. After that, we're going to presume that the marriage was consummated, whether it's possible to consummate or not. My own view is that you have just what the law says that you have. You have a true marriage, but an incomplete marriage. Now, of course, it's theoretically possible at any time that you could later consummate the marriage. Whatever the impediment is to consummation could be rectified. I mean, in the age of stem cells, and I don't mean embryonic stem cells, but in the age of stem cell science, it's even now in prospect, the possibilities in prospect that you could regenerate sexual sexual organs. So you remain a man and a woman, you remain a male and a female, because your maleness or femaleness is not just external genitalia. It suffuses your whole being. And we certainly wouldn't be undermining the very nature of marriage by acknowledging these incomplete marriages of males and females, where non-consummation is not something that is impeded by necessity or intrinsically, but is only impeded contingently. It's just a contingent fact that this person is suffering from paralysis or has necessarily had to have the organs removed because of cancer or something like that. And I think that's probably the best way to treat it. It's a case where hard cases make bad law. It's a kind of a case that's at the edge, and the law over time has learned to deal with those kinds of things in a way that, makes the most sense under the circumstances.
My question is for Professor George and for Justice Griffiths. If it is that marriage...
It's Judge.
Judge, I'm sorry. Judge.
Yeah. We're hoping, though. We're hoping. Got my candidate, as I said.
If marriage is so important that it has to be, that society, the state has to have some say in it, then should it be much more difficult than it is to get divorces, or does that impede on individual freedom too much?
Judge, you're probably not allowed to. Yeah, I don't think the judge can actually opine on that, but I can. I think it's much too easy to get a divorce. I think no fault or so-called unilateral divorce, which makes divorce makes marriage less than a contract. Marriage should be more than a contract. It's got to be a contract, of course. It should be more than a contract. It's less than a contract, because you're not allowed to just break your contracts. You have consequences if you break your contracts. We've backed ourselves into a situation coming out of what I referred to at the Fidelio group meeting yesterday as the age of Aquarius. One more bad 60s idea. We backed ourselves into the idea that marriage should be less difficult to get out of even than a contract. Now, I'll explain something to you, because I was a kid. I was even younger than you at the time. You are now. But I can remember it very well, because I remember the argument. People said, well, look, if a man and a woman are fighting all the time, they're quarreling, they're not getting along, neither's getting much satisfaction out of marriage, why should the law make them stay together? And why should we invest resources in courts and trouble people like future Justice Griffiths and so forth with these quarrelsome couples? Wouldn't it just be easier if we created a simple, no-fault standard of divorce, and if they don't want to be married, we won't force them to be married. They can just get out of it, and we'll deal with the kids and the financial settlement and ease the whole thing. And we won't have people coming in making accusations against each other and proving fault and so forth and so on. I mean, it sounded pretty good, right? It sounded like a good argument. I mean, there are going to be a certain number of people going to want to be divorced. It just happens. Nothing's perfect in this world. Why make it so hard for them? We'll let them get out of it. It's easier for everybody. It doesn't take the court's time. Less trouble. And by the way, Brad, where are you? Okay, by the way, you remember this. The children will benefit. Because children living with these quarreling parents, man, it's so tough on them, and it'd just be better for the kids if the parents separate. Right? That's what they said. All right. Now, as far as that last point is concerned, we now have 40, 50 years of social scientific evidence. Completely dead wrong. Brad, you've done some of this work. Elizabeth Marquardt has done the work. We now know that divorce is a catastrophe for children. Now, does that mean it should never occur? Well, you got to get people out of abusive relationships or get kids out of situations where there's actual abuse. But in most cases, including cases where couples are not getting along very well, the kids are still better off if they stay together. But more generally, the problem with what sounded like a pretty good argument is this. Nobody bothered to ask the question, well, if we change the laws on divorce, won't that alter the understanding of marriage that people have when they enter into marriage in the first place? Won't that change the understanding of whether marriage is or isn't a lifetime permanent commitment in the culture, such that the nature of the relationship that they think they're entering into will differ, causing an increase in the divorce rate? They didn't ask. Now, had they thought about it a little bit, they would have thought, that's a potential problem. I mean, this could have big social effects, which, guess what? It turns out it has. You know, it's hard to quantify, Brad. I don't know, 10%, 12%. You know, 17. Okay. A substantially increased divorce rate as a result of the introduction of no-fault divorce. Those folks thought that everything would stay the same and there would only be benefit, less trouble, time, money, court being bothered than before. But that isn't the way things turned out. It altered the understanding of marriage and affected the quality of marriages and divorce rates. That's why you need to think about these things in advance. So when somebody comes along and says, gee, what harm could it do to let Bob and Harry get married? Maybe we don't really think they're married, but if the law thinks that they're married, how does that hurt? Does it hurt your marriage? Doesn't have any social effects. You got to think of how it affects the culture's understanding of what marriage is in the first place. Let's not repeat the mistakes that we made in no-fault divorce. In fact, I think if we can win the marriage battle when it comes to the definition of marriage, that's only the beginning. That's only the beginning. Because we've got a huge boulder to roll back up a hill. If we save the definition of marriage, the next step has to be rebuilding the marriage culture. And that will mean, I believe, reforming the reforms that gave us no-fault divorce.
Let's take two more questions, and then we'll end the conference.
Great. Okay, my question is directed at Professor George, but I'd be happy to hear the opinions of anyone else who wants to comment. At the beginning of your remarks, you referenced how we now understand, or will have understood for generations, that a culture that contributes to discouraging marriage and encouraging out-of-wedlock childbirth contributes to a culture of poverty, now something that sociologists have been denying for decades but are now looking at again. And I want to ask about sort of the policy side of this question. We know that the major policy achievement we're going for is defining marriages between one man and one woman. We've referenced divorce a little bit. What other sort of policies are you in favor of to promote the sanctity of marriage and encourage marriage in our society?
Okay, that's a really important question. Now, we mustn't think that the solution to all our marital woes is public policies in the sense of government policies. Government's role is subsidiary. There's a whole doctrine called subsidiarity, the idea that the state should intervene, law should intervene, only when the mediating institutions, what Paul was talking about this morning, the institutions of civil society, can't effectively accomplish what needs to be accomplished. So making sure we get the definition of marriage right, getting sensible laws of dissolution and distribution of benefits and so forth in a dissolved marriage to replace the no-fault regime that we have. Those are important things that public policy can do. But there are all sorts of things that it really falls to churches to do. Churches, not the LDS Church, but a lot of churches, including my own Catholic Church, a lot of churches have been AWOL, absent without leave, on marriage questions that have nothing to do with the civil law, preparing people for marriage, giving people a sound understanding of what marriage is integrated into the doctrines and teachings of their faith, counseling couples who are in difficult marriages, making sure that there are mentor couples who've been through the experiences of marriage and have had some troubled times themselves, mentoring younger couples, or stepping in with interventions when younger couples in the faith community are having some problems. All marriages are going to have rocky little periods. It's human nature. It's the way it is. So I want the law to do what it can do sort of at the boundaries. And then the close-in fine work that needs to be done, that's got to be done by churches, and that's got to be done by families. In the traditional marriage ceremony in the Catholic Church, and I think this is true, Brad, too, in the at least some of the Protestant churches, because I hear this in the evangelical services when I attend friends' weddings from that tradition. There's an exhortation to the assembly that we have to be the family now that supports this marriage. Now that's got to be more than just rhetoric. People have to understand that that's right. We are the family, that we're all invested in each other's marriages. We need to be the family, this church, this community, this parish, that supports the marriage that's now taking place. We're not just sending the couple out on their own and we wish you luck and do your best. We're going to be there for you. So I think church policy in a way is more important than public policy. Public policy's got to get the general stuff right, the definition and the laws about dissolution and so forth. custody and all that. And then the real close-in work with the particular individual couples has got to be done by other institutions.
Catherine, Brad, did you want to add anything in response to that question?
Just one more point on the issue of the diagnosis and then the prescription, and that is there's a good body of research, not just the thing I mentioned earlier from the Brookings Institution, but work at Penn State, for instance, which clearly articulates the ways in which the breakdown of marriage has disproportionately fallen on the backs of the poor. So for instance, the Penn State study that I've come across recently finds that about 41% of increasing income inequality in the US can be attributed to the breakdown of marriage. So if you hear people talking about their concern about equality in this country, as well as poverty, bring them back to the marriage point that Robbie made earlier. So that's one point. On the policy end of things, I think one more thing that's important for us to think about is the way in which many of our public policies unintentionally penalize marriage because we have means-tested public policies. So if you earn above a certain amount of money, you can't access, for instance, food stamps or housing aid. And the problem is that when you're cohabiting, you don't have to count the income of your cohabiting partner when you're getting government benefits. Whereas if you're married, you do. And so there's a very real financial penalty that many working class, and especially poor couples, pay if they get married. And it's one reason that they're not getting married. So we can, I think, at least fix that too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that Brad just made. I don't know how to say this delicately, but any policy that incentivizes people who are in a sexual partnership to not get married is insane.
Last question.
My question is directed to Dr. George, and there have been several current actions that have sought to demonstrate the pervasiveness and the permissibility of same-sex marriage, same-sex families, ranging from a recent New York Times article talking about how in the South they have multiple communities with same-sex families that have come to even outnumber those in New York and in California, and to such films as The Kids Are All Right, which is a recent contender in the Academy Awards. How would you feel are some of the ramifications, the long-term ramifications of and for such families in the United States?
Well, I agree with Brad. I mean, my hypothesis based on what we know thus far is that the children who lack an opposite-sex parent and have been in many cases deliberately created without without a parent of both sexes, I think are going to suffer from that. Not in every case by standard measures like delinquency or drug abuse and so forth, but I think in every case in moral ways, because the most important, the most fundamental thing beyond getting your kids, keeping your kids safe and fed and minimally educated, the most important thing parents do for their children is model upright, morally upright behavior to them. Now that just gets factored out of the equation. Everybody wants to know, okay, what's the drug abuse rate, what's the crime rate, the incarceration rate, and so forth. People forget that the fundamental task of parents is to teach their kids to be morally upright people. And if you believe what we believe, then that's one thing same-sex partners are not going to be doing, and especially since such a high percentage of those partnerships we now know, as a matter of fact, are so-called open partnerships. So kids are not going to be getting a healthy understanding of sexuality and how sexuality ought to be integrated into their own lives, so that it's a constructive force that serves their flourishing and not a destructive force. Your comment also illustrates something that Brad and Catherine both referenced, and that is the importance of some kind of counter-pressure in the media and in the entertainment industry to the pressure that kids come under today to accept liberal ideas about sexuality and just about everything else. I mean, it's a constant bombardment. I mean, it's no surprise that the majority of young people today have pretty much anything goes views about sexuality. It's no surprise that at universities that don't begin with the word Brigham, there's a hookup culture that's just horrible, an anarchic culture that was described in Tom Wolfe's novel, I Am Charlotte Simmons. It's no surprise that happens. I mean, this has been the message of the media and the entertainment industry at least since the 1960s. I think the big unspoken scandal in the American culture is the sexualization of children. The latest case, MTV show Skins. How did that happen? Well, I think it happened because so many people, so many adults accepted the literally unbelievable proposition. I mean that very literally, not possible of being believed, but somehow they accepted it. That you could have a circumstance of what they would call sexual liberty, I would call sexual anarchy, for adults, and that you could wall children off from it. You could protect children from it by creating a wall that would hide it from children. They think you're actually going to protect children against pornography by putting an opaque placard over the Hustler magazine, everything but the title, in the newsstand in the airport, right? In fact, in a culture whose airport newsstands feature magazines like that, you know already you got a big problem and that you're going to get the sexualization of children. The only way we're going to overcome the sexualization of children is to restore to the adult culture, a sound understanding of sexual morality that really stigmatizes bad sexual behavior and pornography and other evils among adults.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance. We are happy to be able to have these kinds of discussions. We're overjoyed that you should come and that these fine people came at some discomfort, I have to say. It took well over 20 hours, I think, for both Professor Pacolic and Professor Wilcox to be with us. I know that Professor Alvarez, who was to be here, spent 3 hours on the tarmac and had to go back, and she tried all day to get out. And so we want to thank her in absentia for her efforts to be here. This comes at a sacrifice to these people, and it is a testimony to their dedication to truth, to virtue, to knowledge, that they would come here and talk with us and teach us about these things. We're grateful to have the ability at the Wheatley Institution to try to become a center for discussions like this and for those who support and sustain these efforts in this institution. And thank you very much for coming. One more round of applause for our visiting scholars.